Welcome to Psychoanalysis and You, the podcast of the American Psychoanalytic Association. I'm your host, Dr. Gail Saltz. I'm a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist. This is Psychoanalysis and You. I'm joined today by two guests. I have Dr. Jessica Benjamin, a renowned psychoanalyst who has made groundbreaking contributions to relational psychoanalysis, the theory of intersubjectivity, and the integration of feminism and gender studies into psychoanalytic discourse. She practices psychoanalysis in New York City, where she teaches and supervises at the NYU Postdoctoral Program in Psychoanalysis. Her influential works include The Bonds of Love, exploring the dynamics of recognition in human development and social power structures, especially gender, and her more recent book, Beyond Doer and Done To, which explores the importance of acknowledgment in moving out of harming relationships into reparative connection. And I also have with me today Dr. Chris Walling, who is Associate Professor of Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies and is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst. He has led programs at various medical and psychological institutions, including the UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine and the University of Kentucky College of Medicine, and is a well-known contributor in the field of body psychotherapy as research chair and past president of the United States Association for Body Psychotherapy. He has been a consultant on major biomedical research programs in the advances in trauma psychology, brain health, and the use of mind-body therapies. A graduate of the New Center for Psychoanalysis in Los Angeles, where he is in private practice, he teaches and writes on the integration of relational psychoanalysis and somatic psychotherapies. Thank you both for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
Yes, thank you very much.
So this is really so timely. Many people, without realizing, are thinking a lot about this material. In fact, unless you live under a rock and don't watch any news, this is really front and center for so many. So in light of your extensive work in psychoanalysis and body psychotherapy, respectively, how do you believe the trauma experienced from recent global conflicts, both domestic and international, is affecting individuals in both their bodies and in their minds?
Well, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is failure and helplessness. Failure of our leaders to prevent and then to halt needless, in my view, violence, and then the helplessness that all the rest of us feel when we express our dismay and our protest against this, and then we are not listened to, and we realize the way in which what's called geopolitics is so alienated from the moral and psychological considerations, maybe is a broad word, but feelings that so many of us carry. I think that we then are put in the position of watching terrible things, knowing that terrible things are happening, and yet being unable to do anything about it, and even not able to properly witness. But we try to be witnesses, but to be a proper witness in a way means to actually receive the testimony of those who are being injured, those who are suffering. And we're not in a position to directly receive their suffering and to witness it in a way that could create a different kind of human solidarity, right? A different kind of connection, so that, I mean, obviously the people who are suffering and injured are terribly helpless. In a certain way, all of us are losing our capacity for agency, but also for connection to one another in a way that lets us feel that we're creating a different kind of social world or a different kind of relationship to, let's say, historic problems that we know exist, that we're creating a more nonviolent and really, I want to say that creating relationships that are based on recognition of the dignity of all people, the respect for all people. When we aren't able to do that, we also suffer, even if we're not directly the ones being disrespected or harmed.
On the one hand, all the witnessing creates, I think, a lot of trauma, which we'll talk further about. But you're saying, on the other hand, if the avoidance or not witnessing creates a lot of moral injury.
Yeah, there's a bit of a paradox here where we know that trauma healing, for example, occurs in so many ways at the same area in which that we get broken in moments of conflict or war, meaning there's sort of this necessity of embodied witnessing that really is what restores and promotes connection and growth. But none of that can happen until there's acknowledgement. And this is so much a part, I think, of what Jessica has written about throughout her whole life, is that trauma healing can't occur until there's acknowledgement. And so this is the witnessing paradox, is we first have to name what is happening before we can actually use that witnessing towards health or growth or restoration.
So interesting. We often talk about what are we doing directly in our office with our patients. Well, those are people who've already identified themselves, right, as experiencing trauma. And we should absolutely be talking about them. But since we're starting with this very big umbrella, many of these people are people who maybe never come to our offices, right there. And we can apply the same concepts of treatment to them if they are willing to think about it, if we get this information out there. You're sitting in your home, you're watching the TV, you're reading the newspaper. Based on what you're describing, what is the mindset that would be the healthier approach, right? Because sometimes they're hearing, I'm so stressed by what I'm experiencing that it's making me symptomatic. I should not look. I should not read this. I should not watch this. And on the other side, you're saying sometimes maybe that isn't the better thing, or it certainly doesn't work. How should a general public think about the concepts that you're bringing forward in terms of how they respond?
Well, I was actually going to turn it over for a moment to Chris just because I wanted him to say something about the way that we process trauma collectively and individually. But I'll say one thing about how we should respond is perhaps not. That's what we ask ourselves, but that's in a way not the right question, right? The right question first is, how am I responding? What feeling is this bringing up for me, or what conflicts or conflicted feelings? And one of the interesting concepts that's been going around in relational psychoanalysis comes from an intellectual historian, Michael Rothberg, the idea of the implicated subject. And the feeling that you are, in some sense, forced to participate in a system that is creating events and facts that you are upset by. But also, we're not always aware of the way that we are inhabiting this system such that we can't help be complicit, even though we might be suffering from it. This very vexed problem that people have in the face of witnessing injustice and knowing that they're both complicit, but also resisting and protesting it. And I don't just mean politically, externally. I mean, internally feeling in some way abraded, if not actually violated by what you're witnessing. And then at the same time, knowing that there are all these ways you can't help being complicit and participating in the system. So I think that produces, let's say, stress on your nervous system, right? This is like there's an ongoing nervous system stress, knowing bad things are happening. I'm not part of it. I am part of it. I'm not part of it. And that whole experience of helplessness parallels individual trauma to a certain degree. Maybe at one remove, but it's still having that same stress on your system. So we could call that perhaps vicarious trauma.
Yeah, what you're saying is, to your point and to the question, I think, is that macrocosm affects us in the microcosm. And so the same kind of trauma-informed principles of like really limiting our exposure to daily onslaughts of notifications and headlines and news exposure. We can't just be drinking from the trough of horrific news all day long and expect our bodies to be socially engaged and capable of genuine connection. And so we must become ever the more mindful that information has to have a diet in the same way the food that we put in our mouths. We must be mindful of the kinds of information that we are consuming so that it does not preclude our capacity to see the good both in ourselves and one another.
This is so timely at this moment where, I mean, it's hard to imagine that there could be more global conflict, but also our nations divide and conflict on so many issues. We wonder why rates of depression and anxiety are rising and people are struggling as they are. And this is so timely in that sense. So you would say bringing this kind of psychoanalytic understanding to the general public, part of it would be evaluating what you're taking in, its effect on your mind. And you're saying, of course, there's mind body connection, it's connected to our body. And how do we decide how to limit versus not? Do you talk with patients about that directly in your office?
Every single day, in the same way that we would want to talk about, what they're feeling in the here and now and how that has a direct tributary from those kinds of lifestyle practices. And we have to think about our exposure to information as a kind of lifestyle practice of sorts that requires the same kind of mental hygiene considerations that we approach around our physical hygiene so that it's more balanced and mindful and reflective.
Could I just interject, though, that there is a certain danger in this position because, in a way, we're not just consuming food or a diet that affects our body. We're also part of a collective
Mhm,
where
mhm,
it's one thing to say, I don't need to flood myself with every detail of what's going on. But on the other hand, I'm actually responsible for knowing or doing something. And now, if you're a doer kind of person, which I've been all my life, an activist in various ways, you have a different kind of conflict where, yes, you still have to be limiting yourself, but where might I have even a small way of expressing and possibly having an effect in line with my values? So trying to do that at the same time,
mhm,
trying not to simply say, well, I have to protect my nervous system, as it were,
mhm,
but I have to protect my nervous system enough to be able to be an active
mhm.
subject in my world. And I think that's actually trickier.
Yeah, that's the balance, is to be really helpful and effective in implementing social change, which I think employs all of us to sort of pay closer attention to where we can implement change, requires this balancing principle of like, am I under resourced today? Am I going to be able to be as effective today, given that I haven't had good rest and I didn't eat well last night? And as a result, I might not be the most effective at helping others who are struggling right now. And I think we as clinicians have to learn this discipline that now we, to your sort of point here, are teaching our patients each and every day.
So, Dr. Benjamin, considering your groundbreaking work on social repair processes, how can these concepts help us understand and navigate the collective trauma that we're referring to, right? That societies endure during and particularly after conflicts on the ground. What role does recognition and mutual understanding play in the collective healing process?
Well, that's a very big question. And it's true, I have spent much of my life thinking about what does that mean, mutual recognition? It means many different things, starting with the development of the very tiny infant or child who's having a bond of mutual recognition with their parent. That's important in the sense that one of the very first things that we would like people to be exposed to and learning when they're just, wee things is that there's such a thing as repair. Real repair means acknowledgement. So if something I did hurt you, and with infants, it could be a very small thing, like you just didn't handle them physically in a way that made them comfortable and they're protesting. You just automatically, hopefully, acknowledge, oh, that hurt, or oh, that didn't feel, oh, that water is too cold, right? You do that, and often you'll see that adults who are with small children who are not yet verbal will still be narrating the whole time. And we know that this is tremendously important, but the stance, the attitude that a nonverbal creature, right? The animal part of the organismic world, that it deserves respect, and that whether that animal or being is really able to understand our words isn't really the key thing. The key thing is our conveying the sense that they deserve the respect for their bodily and mental and emotional integrity, right? So that begins very early, but you could extend that. It, ripples out all the way into the big world of how we treat the planet, how we treat the species that are being extinguished, how we relate to those, shall we say, human-made losses, has to do with the same principle of acknowledgement that you hope you are conveying to a small child. And that principle of acknowledgement is the only way we can put things right is when we acknowledge them. Now, when you acknowledge to somebody or to a collective who has been harmed, that is simultaneously a kind of recognition of their human dignity. So those two things go together. Now, if we want to make them mutual, we have to say, well, what does it mean for, let's say, a group to accept that acknowledgement, to recognize the one who's giving that acknowledgement? What we're seeing so often is really the most distressing form of insincerity. And so the Native American poet, she wrote this book called Whereas, in which she details all the statements that were made about giving acknowledgement for having taken away everything from this people. And then in each case, what is the point of what the government was saying? It was, whereas we admit that we've done all this, we're not going to give you anything. We're not going to do anything for
So
you.
an insincere, unempathic apology.
Right, but also with no intention to make genuine repair. So there has to be an intention to make genuine repair.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mhm.
If you were to say it's like as if you were to say to this small baby, oh, this water is too cold, and then you didn't add warm water to it.
You said, sorry,
But I'm not,
it just
but I
is.
just won't turn on the hot water for you
Mm-hmm.
because I don't want to spend the money to turn the hot water on. Imagine that writ large for the entire continent and millions of people. That's essentially what we're seeing in so many ways.
So interesting. I have not heard it explained in that very clear way. And I suspect if I have not, that the public has not heard. I think most people don't understand, for example, in this nation, many discussions going on and different kinds of behaviors occurring around, for example, reparations.
Right.
Of all kinds. Some groups saying we are going to do something concrete, like money or land, and others saying we're not going to, either saying we're not going to, or actually acknowledging maybe they think they can't. They actually can't.
Very good point.
Yeah, one thing I'll say around that is we've seen through so much of liberation psychology and research in this world around liberation and processes of repair that we have to understand that we have to be resourced in ourselves before we can take accountability to tolerate being implicated. In other words, it's really hard to engage in repair if you yourself feel stuck in what Jessica has often called the doer and done to sort of scenario. And that means that the first piece of work that we must do on ourselves is to actually be willing to take accountability for certain things, to acknowledge first in ourselves that we are all implicated, that we all hurt one another sometimes, and that makes us very human. And so that requires a kind of resourcing in ourselves before we can actually then engage in mutual recognition and reparative processes.
There's something very important to add to that in the spirit of yes and that Chris enjoins me to. It's not only, I think, good to think of it as resourcing. I think it's good to think of it even more specifically as a certain kind of compassion for the self, for the fact that we are stuck in many ways participating in this do or done to situation. There has to be a certain amount, shall we say, of self-forgiveness in order not to be immobilized or in order not to get caught in this game of reversal where you say, okay, I'm guilty of this, but you're guilty of that. Those back and forthings of blame and shame, where people are mostly trying to get away from shame. So very specifically, what you're talking about, Chris, is when you say resource, you're really talking about having a part of self that is able to do this forgiving and do this action of acceptance of injury and harm in order to be able to proceed to do anything about it.
I mean, that seems like one of the hardest tasks, certainly, that one can help a patient in your office over time, perhaps be able to manage shame or humiliation and guilt. It's part of what we do so that you can accept responsibility. But it's on a larger level. It seems like nobody is talking. We are just in a ricochet of shame and defense. And so we seem very stuck, which why the work that you do seems that it could be a real opening gambit.
I would say that shows us why we're so desperately needing psychoanalysis, because isn't that the number one complaint that often a patient brings on day one is I feel stuck. Stuckness is actually what often brings people to want to do depth work on themselves. And so I think, particularly Western, rich, so-called weird countries, as it's sometimes called, industrialized and developed nations, they need some depth psychotherapy. And so it's a call to action for people to begin to look at what we've discovered over the last 100+ years in psychoanalysis. We might have something to offer.
From your perspective as a specialist in embodied psychology, and perhaps you can explain what that really means, what unique challenges do recent conflicts pose for the assaults on the mind and the body in individuals who've experienced or been exposed to these events?
Yeah, so somatic psychology, as we call it here in the US, or body psychology, as it's called in Europe, is an extension of psychoanalysis. It came out of the work of Wilhelm Reich, and neo-Reichians sort of realized that there's a lot to trauma and what we call underrepresented states, experiences that are difficult to think about, that we can't really reflect upon, that sometimes we only know in hindsight or through what we do with our behaviors, that we show these things that we've survived, but we can't really think about these things because they're so overwhelming. So what we've discovered over many generations of somatic clinicians is we enter into reparative and healing processes at the same place in which that the injury occurs, meaning through the body, because the body holds these procedural memories, these bodily based memories that often are delinked or uncoupled from the actual experience itself. The way that we work is first by restoring rhythm of the session, rhythm of turn taking, like we are doing right now in conversation, rhythm of the frame itself, coming to session maybe sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. Then that rhythm establishes a kind of safety that then promotes a capacity to begin to actually represent these horrors with someone who can witness you, with someone who can feel these things with you, because some of these horrific feelings are not meant to be felt on our own. Some of these feelings can only be processed together. And that's because all healing happens through relationship, which is the thing that relational psychoanalysis has taught us for quite a long time.
The physiologic response to trauma, which could be completely cut off from the mind, you're saying that creating these regularities, this structure, helps that physiologic response diminish enough to be able to then, with support and relating, be able to talk about trauma. So let me just ask, in addition to that then, how can a person understand, right, what's happening in that mind body experience, what will they experience, which says to them, hey, yeah, I need more help?
I think we should back up for one moment and say that part of what Chris was talking about was not only structure, but really what we would call interpersonal safety that is based on the essential ingredient of synchrony, which is affect attunement. And when the person feels they're in the presence of someone attuning to them, their body will relax. That is to say, their nervous system will calm down. What we're doing, whether we're doing explicit work with the body or whether we're just keeping in mind this procedural dimension that we're in the room with another person and that our nervous systems are interacting. When we keep that in mind, we really become more able to transmit to the other person, you are not in an unsafe place. You can start to allow certain, shall we say, certain juices to start flowing again that you've blocked. But I guess I also always want to add, in addition to that nonverbal dimension of that, the idea that someone might be able to understand your mind and formulate for you something that you've always known but not been able to say or express can be extremely liberating for a person. And that's part of why I think also people come to therapy. They want help. Sometimes you help them to be able to formulate it, but sometimes they want someone else to validate this happened to you and this is what it felt like. And then it becomes possible to say, yes, it did feel like that. Yes, this really did happen. And that's essential for any trauma healing.
Something so important about the experience of being a trauma survivor. I mean, research is me search. We come to this field honestly. And I think one thing even Jessica and I in our collaborations have discussed is this kind of popular metaphor in trauma healing from the Japanese practice of kintsugi, which means to join with gold in that relationship. It's not as if trauma healing is about restoring us all to some position that we were once in again. In so many ways, we've discovered through research in post-traumatic growth, the emphasis upon what do people do with their traumas? How do we actually make good use of our suffering? How do we actually take the things that have hurt us and make effective change? This is the thing I think Jessica is getting at moving beyond resourcing, is it's so important to let history inform us so that we can indeed be conscious and more aware of how to make a more embodied and connected future.
I think one thing a lot of people are unclear about, and maybe you could help clarify from your vantage point, how should we be defining trauma? Has everybody had trauma? Life is traumatic. We are witnessing trauma. Is that trauma? In the psychiatry community, we'd say, well, it needed to be something where you felt your life was at risk and it was beyond the normal human experience.
Mm-hmm.
That is one type of clinical definition of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, many more people, I think, struggle with, well, really, is what I'm experiencing trauma?
We are indeed a traumatized species. That is, in fact, what we've learned from modern medicine. The explosion of chronic illness, the changes to our epigenetic patterning that has rewired us from our capacity for connection towards self-protection is indeed a rather universal phenomenon. And that's because we have not had a moment of reckoning with how, as Jessica puts it, we've always been stuck in this doer and done to complementarity. And so, yes, there's an absolute empirical and valid truth that we see not only from modern medicine, but from our social history that suggests that we are indeed all traumatized.
And are some of us capable of managing that trauma on our own? Or would you say really everybody A could benefit from, or B needs some sort of intervention to help manage trauma?
Well, I don't think that necessarily everyone needs individual help bearing certain basic conditions of their life because they are struggling with feeling unsafe all the time. And so there are different levels of trauma and of unsafety, clearly. And some people are truly unable to manage in life, to connect to other people. They're terrified. However, if we think more generally of those people who aren't suffering from that kind of severe trauma, this universal level of disconnection from other human beings through the way our society is constructed, so that we're not receiving, let's say, a certain kind of feedback from other people on a continuing basis. Yes, you are human. Yes, I see you. It's what the South Africans refer to as Ubuntu. And I had the opportunity to be at a conference with Desmond Tutu, Archbishop, who was describing, again, as he often has, what Ubuntu means. And part of what Ubuntu means is the idea, I am because you are, that is, I'm constituted as a real person only when I'm actually in connection with another person. But he also used it more specifically to say a person who has Ubuntu, that is, has that attitude of Ubuntu, is able to give other human beings that sense of being connected and having dignity because you matter. And your existence when you're with me matters to me just because now I'm with another human being.
Is it the presence or is it the listening and being listened to?
Those are impossible to separate. The thing that I teach our graduate students who are becoming psychotherapists is that the real therapeutic action of therapy is therapeutic presence, which requires a capacity for embodied witnessing, for deep attunement, deep listening. And that is something that we acquire by sitting with our patients days in and days out, time after time. And so it is a both and, as Jessica is saying, which is my favorite sort of metaphor for how connection happens. Yeah, that's how therapeutic relationships form.
What is different today? You hear a lot of discussion of body, soma, and therapy in the same sentence. I think psychoanalysts traditionally don't talk about that, right?
That's changing, thankfully.
It is changing. So can you say something about that? Sort of why wasn't it? What has occurred now or is understood now, and how that is being brought into our understanding of psychoanalytic treatment?
There are many threads that come together, which is often the case, that there's a kind of synchronicity. There's a movement in a historical period, right? In a certain direction. Like I can look at Instagram now and see all of these recommendations for how to regulate yourself before you react and respond to your child, right? So before you hit that, don't do that anger button, put on your oxygen mask of self-regulation, and et cetera. It's very funny in a way as a therapist to watch all this stuff being conveyed in these little reels. So I think that's tremendously important, actually. However, I was going to say that at the same time, there's something very specific that I believe changed our field and changed what we're doing that had to do with people beginning to study infancy and study the mother-infant relationship. And that changed many assumptions that people conventionally associate with psychoanalysis as being simply the basic ideas that Freud had. And actually, it's striking that even with all of this new emphasis, people think that psychoanalysis is still being practiced as though we were in the 1920s, as though it were 100 years ago.
Hence, we're doing this podcast.
Right. Hence, we're doing this. Right. There are many different threads, obviously, that came together that changed psychoanalysis. But for me, and I think this is very crucial in talking about embodiment, when we started to look at very early preverbal relations, when we started to look at how affect goes back and forth between human beings, one of them being just in the early phase of development, and started to look at the neurological components of how that relational experience of let's say, affect attunement or misattunement, how those things are affecting our brains and also how they're affecting our emotional wiring and our nervous system. When we started to be able to do that, we got to a lot of things that are now, as I said, they're on Instagram.
I think psychoanalysis can't possibly work with traumatic states without acknowledging the body now. And that's why it's so heavily written about over the last decade in psychoanalysis. And that's thanks to people like Jessica and her contemporaries who helped give us the relational turn that then allowed psychoanalysis to continue to grow and advance and be able to meet the real challenges of today, like these types of conflicts and horrific experiences.
So, how could we help a larger public understand if they're symptomatic, if they're struggling, if they feel stuck, if they feel traumatized, whether what it would mean to participate in a somatic psychotherapy? What would that mean? And how do they know, well, that really could be helpful to them?
Well, again, I think it's helpful to say somatic and say relational at the same time, because what comes to my mind in terms of what you were just saying before and what Chris was saying is that one of the big changes brought about by relational psychoanalysis was to return to the theory of dissociation that Genet developed and that Freud ultimately, he didn't completely jettison it, but he moved away from it toward the idea of repression. And he simultaneously moved away from the idea of trauma. So when we went back to trauma, we went back to dissociation. And dissociation means that the self has to actually split. So that's at the self level. But at the nervous system level, it means, for instance, that people actually shut down. And they can shut down so far that they even lose bodily sensation. Now, all of this was noted by Freud when he wrote about hysteria, when he worked with hysteria. But as we all know, he moved away from that to the understanding of neurosis. Well, nowadays, we don't necessarily see somebody who comes in and says, I can't move my arm, which Freud did. But what we do see is people who come in reporting all kinds of traumatic experience that they had, especially as children, and that they can tell you something happened, but they cannot access it. The moment that they are even beginning to think about this thing, something happens to their nervous system. And we call that dissociation, meaning you can't really access the true response to that experience. So part of going through the body in the way that Chris is trained to do is helping them be present, be safe, but be able to go back, shall we say, into the experience? Would you put it that way?
That's absolutely correct. What that you can expect is you'd walk in and it's less about a story and more about what are you experiencing right now here with me? What's it like to be in the room with me? And what are you noticing in your body as we try to find each other right now? And so it's really going to be for many patients a deviation from what they thought psychotherapy would be, meaning it's not about so much your past. It's really about starting from the place of the here and now. And that's really important.
So let's just say, for example, that a patient, because what you're describing, for example, we're suddenly coming to understand, I think publicly, many people are understanding that, for example, a survivor of a sexual assault will experience in the moment, in the trauma, dissociation, which remains, which may mean that memory is repressed, or there are only bits and pieces of it. Certainly they can't touch it. Certainly they can't process it. Sometimes, there was a recent story of an actress who came forward. It was 30 years, even though she was immersed professionally in that kind of material, 30 years before she could remember what happened in a sexual assault and therefore begin to even process that. I could imagine, right? And I think many people could imagine that if you were a survivor of sexual assault and something was difficult and you came in to talk about it, that talking about your body would be maybe very frightening.
Chris, that's exactly what I think he was trying to say, which is that if you talk to somebody about how they feel in their body, just sitting here anticipating talking about something, that will already start to become in awareness that I am so frightened. And this sense that I am so frightened, I think, is crucial to recovering any experience.
In the relating, you're the holder of that.
And we also pay really close attention to restoring orientation first, meaning, can we just be present together before we ever go into the body? I mean, that's the paradox here is trauma survivors don't want to go into their bodies. That's the place they work so hard to avoid often. So we aren't going to start from, let's deep dive right in. We're going to start from, I wonder what it's like to notice that pleasing painting that's on the wall over there. And how does that feel to just connect to that tree that you can see in the front of my office? It's really about stabilization first.
Interesting. So different from psychoanalysis, right? Might not be initially, at least, going deeper, but really helping them to process from the outside in.
That's what all my analytic patients tell me is they'll say to me, Dr. Walling, I could never have done psychoanalysis had we not started our work together somatically first. It was what allowed them to begin to feel safe again through connection.
It's so important that clinicians be really well versed. You both teach. How do you approach teaching such that clinicians can be, as it's critically important, aware of where to begin, how slow to go, and when are the signs to go further?
So it's interesting that Chris and I agree about many things, but we do come from different directions. And so the very direct way in which Chris is talking to people about being present and creating safety is not the way that you would start if you are working psychoanalytically. You start with where the patient, whatever the patient is telling you, and you try to find a way both to move forward with them and be connected. What I find myself teaching supervising is that very often there's a different kind of dissociation than the one we were just describing when there's an actual assault or when there's an actual bodily injury. And that is the dissociation of what am I feeling right now that's actually causing me to be unhappy and unable to cohere as a self. So what I find is that many therapists, especially when they're beginning, know that something is wrong, know that they're sort of going in a circle with the patient. And what's happening is that they are dissociating along with the patient the fear, the anxiety that is actually present, the desperation that is actually present, but shall we say sequestered like somewhere else? We could say this inside the patient. And what Chris is saying, I think, is that if we all learned some of these body modalities and methodologies, maybe we wouldn't get into that stuck place so easily with the patient because we would be actually tuning in to those things that are very often dissociated. The flip side is just that at some point, if you don't learn how to work psychoanalytically, that is, if you don't learn how to actually be able to use yourself, which is what psychoanalysts do, use yourself.
Use your countertransference,
Right.
understand it.
Right. If you don't, and use the fact that you were, for instance, cut off from, that is dissociated, about the patient's anxiety or despair. If you don't learn how to use those things, there's a problem. So relationally, what I emphasize, and I think this is important to some of our joint work, right, is that you then need to acknowledge that sometimes very explicitly you can acknowledge to another person, to a patient, oh, I didn't realize how much you were feeling about that. I didn't know that, but I'm not saying it to blame myself, like as if I were in the old days, you'd say, well, if I had the right idea, but now it's more like, no, I understand that I've been sucked into a certain kind of dissociative place with the other person. That's inevitably going to happen. What I'm now better at is paying attention, shall we say, to the flow of that or the movement, right? Into the dissociation, out of the dissociation.
So it's recognizing that in yourself so that you can and empathically express such to the patient, and there's a healing in that. I also, it's interesting, don't think a lot of people think a result of a fantasy or thought internally that is traumatizing to them, like you said, not as a sexual assault survivor, but
because they're alone with it. And what we're really emphasizing here is when people are alone with their bad thoughts,
yes,
right?
And that's the key here is like we undo the aloneness. You asked, how do we teach this? We teach this through experience. A clinician cannot learn how to do this until they themselves have learned experientially to be in it. So this is the thing often the public doesn't realize about depth psychotherapies is we only learn to do this by receiving it first.
So like in psychoanalysis, certainly, right, I went through
Yes.
my own
Same.
psychoanalysis, as anybody who goes through psychoanalytic
That's right.
training is required to do.
That's right.
Similarly, you're saying
We're all patients first, and that's actually how you teach it, is you teach it through the experience-dependent sort of learning environment. And we work at the university that I teach at very experientially, to where there's actual exercises that we do in class to work in the presence of a body-to-body connection.
and you feel like that is really vital.
It's the only way to learn it.
I find it so interesting that we all go through this, but historically, that is never shared with the patient, right? That there's sort of this, and I think that is something that is changing, but
Mhm.
something that has been very present in the history of psychoanalysis to not share anything about yourself, including that as part of your training, you have been where they are. Is that different now? Is that something that you would say, oh, it would be important to share?
I think that is part of what we think of, let's say, as the relational turn, is that you are making yourself available. However, people have very wild ideas, let's say, about what it would mean to make yourself available or to use your own experience. And they imagine that you're disclosing all kinds of very specific things about yourself or your history versus doing something that actually we could learn back in the mid-century of the 20th century from an analyst like Donald Winnicott in Britain, who's an object relations analyst, who would say to a patient, from what I'm experiencing or feeling or thinking right now, I infer that you must be. If I'm feeling this X, you must be feeling Y. So in reality, this is not like a simple shocking moment. In reality, people were developing this for a long time. Big difference is simply the notion that you don't have to be as rigid about this because, and this goes for me to exactly what Chris's area of somatic experience is, namely, what you can't do or should not do is reveal something to someone that's going to dysregulate your nervous system so much that you're then not available to them. So your capacity to have absorbed something with compassion and understanding about yourself and your self-regulation are considerations about whether something you say would be useful to the other person and not just its content.
That's the disciplined spontaneity that we learn as clinicians is we self-regulate to co-regulate. And that's hopefully something that folks get to experience from us. And it places a tremendous amount of responsibility on the analyst.
Well, I think in these times of, as you alluded to earlier, Instagram and TikTok therapy or, therapy tidbits, it's so important that people be able to understand what some of the words they're hearing means. What do you really mean by body, by trauma, by somatic when we talk about psychotherapy? So it's wonderful that you've been able to elucidate that, especially in what you're pointing out are these very traumatic times on many different levels in a population that is really struggling with a lot of these kinds of issues. So I thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now for some Freudian quickies. You sent in your questions for an analyst, and I grabbed an analyst with an answer. If you offer a patient a dream interpretation, how sure are you about it?
I think that it's just one way of understanding a dream and that it's multifaceted. So although I feel certain about it, I'm also aware that it may not land.
Both not at all and somewhat sure. I'm not sure of anything that I say, frankly, including what I'm saying right now. And at the same time, there's a felt sense in the room when you offer an interpretation. The patient gives you clues in their gestures, in their tone of voice, in their response to it, and in the whole of the treatment. So it's contextual. You understand something about this person.
Whatever the patient brings in, their associations to the dream are really, some of the most important. And if they make their own interpretation, that often can be the most powerful one.
Dream interpretations, I believe, like any interpretations, are hypotheses. They are an idea that occurs to me that I might offer to a patient as, this is the way I'm thinking about what you told me your dream could mean. And I'm not saying that I'm right, but you can hold on to it. If I want to get technical, I can talk about the work of Winnicott. A dream interpretation is like a potential transitional object put into the transitional space. The patient can pick it up, look at it, play with it, reject it, but it opens up the opportunity to talk about alternatives, because what you really want to help people with any kind of interpretation is helping them see, there's more than one way to think about anything.
I don't believe there is hardly ever one right final answer, especially if dreams are the unformulated. They don't come out in definitive words, they come out in images, which are access to many associations. So I work with how a dream interpretation shows up in following dreams and how it resonates with a person's life and lived experience over time. But that also requires being in the multiplicity of associations that come through dream images.
At best, 50%. I say that only because I'll have an idea. Usually the point of me making the interpretation is not necessarily to be right, but just to try to get some more insight about what they think is going on. So usually I try to be close to something and then let them take off with whatever else comes to mind for them.
I'm never sure about it because it's always changing. A dream offers us a kind of never-ending story that will often present itself again, morph, change. It provides a huge window into providing people a kind of side glimpse at their own unconscious.
Can psychoanalysis be done in group settings like couples or families or other groups?
I imagine so.
Yes, and it is being done in all of those settings and more.
Psychoanalytic thinking can be applied to all sorts of different organizations and groups and can be really helpful, I think, in thinking about what happens in the world, too.
I work with couples, I work with families, and I think my psychoanalytic training is very helpful in helping families and couples negotiate complicated life situations.
Psychoanalysis is working with the unconscious. Then when we have multiple people together, we have multiple unconsciouses working together and oftentimes projecting, holding things. One person in a couple might hold a lot of the energy of shame or power. And so we see that sometimes more in couples or group settings than in individuals.
The principles that we work with in psychoanalysis also apply to groups of various sizes and types. And so having the insight to understand what's happening would be very helpful, I think, on a group level, but also for people individually.
In terms of a sort of one-to-one methodology, it requires some creativity, obviously, in the changing of the frame. But certainly it's at the heart, I would think, of most of the advanced methods that we see in contemporary psychotherapy, both in groups and beyond.
If you have a question, really any question for a psychoanalyst, send it to apsapodcast@gmail.com, and we will try to feature it in a future Freudian Quickie. For more information about the American Psychoanalytic Association, go to www.apsa.org. Till next time.